Jake stood in the conference room, watching the new CEO through the glass walls as she addressed the board. Something about her posture, the way she tilted her head when listening, made his chest tighten with a memory he'd buried 15 years ago. When she turned toward his direction and their eyes met across the room, time seemed to suspend itself. He knew that face. He knew those eyes. But it couldn't be her. Sarah was dead. He'd mourned her, raised their daughter alone, built a life on the foundation of that loss. Yet there she stood, alive, successful, and staring back at him with the same shock that was coursing through his veins. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The fluorescent lights in the Meridian Tech conference room cast everything in harsh, clinical white. Jake Morrison adjusted his tie for the third time, the silk sliding between fingers that had grown calloused from weekend carpentry projects and 15 years of single parenting. Through the glass walls, he could see employees clustering in small groups, their voices a low murmur of speculation about the new CEO, who was supposed to transform their struggling software company. "You nervous?" Jake turned to find Jake Rivera, his closest friend at the company, holding 2 cups of coffee. Jake's easy smile couldn't quite mask the concern in his eyes. They'd both been through the layoffs 6 months ago, had both survived by the skin of their teeth when the previous CEO had gutted the development team. "Should I be?" Jake accepted the coffee, grateful for something to do with his hands. New leadership always means changes. And you know how these Silicon Valley types are. They come in talking about disruption and paradigm shifts. Jake made air quotes, his voice dropping to mimic corporate speak. Next thing you know, they're outsourcing half the team to save costs. Jake nodded, but his attention drifted to the huddle of executives near the main conference room. He'd been at Meridian for 8 years, had worked his way up from junior developer to team lead, through quiet competence and an almost pathological attention to detail. It was good work, steady work, the kind that let him pick up Emma from soccer practice and help with homework and be the kind of father he'd never had. "Dad?" Both men turned. Emma Morrison stood in the lobby, her backpack slung over one shoulder, dark hair escaping from the ponytail she'd hastily tied that morning. At 14, she'd inherited her mother's delicate bone structure, but her father's steady gaze, and right now that gaze was uncertain. "Em? What are you doing here?" Jake checked his watch. 3:15. School had been out for 15 minutes, but Emma usually went to her friend Chloe's house on Wednesdays. "Chloe's sick, so I thought." She shrugged, the gesture trying for casual but landing somewhere closer to vulnerable. "Can I just hang out until you're done?" "I brought homework." Jake felt that familiar tug between work and parenthood, the constant calibration that single parents knew by heart. But the company had always been flexible about Emma, had even set up a quiet corner in the break room with decent Wi-Fi for the occasions when childcare fell through. "Of course, Jake. This is my daughter Emma." "Em, this is Mr. Rivera." Jake extended his hand with theatrical formality. "Ms. Morrison, I've heard a lot about you." Emma's smile was genuine now. "All lies, I'm sure. Mostly the soccer championships and the honor roll. Very disappointing." The easy banter between them warmed something in Jake's chest. Jake had been one of the few colleagues to really embrace the reality of Jake's life, that sometimes work calls happened during parent-teacher conferences, that Jake left promptly at 5:30, that vacation days were often used for sick children rather than exotic travel. "Attention everyone," the voice carried across the lobby, pitched to command without shouting. Jake looked up to see a woman in an impeccably tailored navy suit standing near the reception desk. She was probably in her late 30s, with shoulder-length auburn hair and dark-rimmed glasses that gave her an air of serious competence. Even from across the room there was something about her that seemed familiar. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, your new CEO. I know you're all curious about changes, about direction, about whether your jobs are safe." She paused, her gaze sweeping the assembled employees. "I'm here to build, not tear down. But that means I need to understand what we're building on. Over the next 2 weeks, I'll be meeting with each department, each team lead, each person who makes this company work." Her eyes found Jake's across the room. Time slowed, the familiar feeling crystallized into something impossible, something that made his coffee cup tremble in his hands. Those eyes, that voice, pitched lower now but with the same musical cadence he'd fallen in love with in college. The way she stood with her weight slightly shifted to her left foot. The unconscious gesture he'd watched 1,000 times during late-night study sessions and lazy Sunday mornings, and the fight that had ended everything. It couldn't be. Sarah was dead. He had the death certificate in a file folder at home, along with Emma's birth certificate and his divorce papers and all the other documents that marked the major transitions of his life. Sarah had died in a car accident 2 weeks after she'd walked out, 2 weeks after she'd told him she needed space to figure out who she was, 2 weeks after he'd found out she was pregnant and she'd refused to talk about it. But this woman, this CEO, was looking at him with the same shock that was currently short-circuiting his nervous system. "Daddy?" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay?" Jake blinked, realizing he'd been staring. The woman, Sarah, not Sarah, impossible. Sarah had continued her introduction, was talking about quarterly goals and market positioning, but her voice kept catching slightly, as if she too was struggling with recognition. "I'm fine," he managed, though his voice sounded strange even to himself. Jake was looking between Jake and the CEO with growing concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The metaphor was too close to the truth. Jake set his coffee cup down carefully, afraid he might drop it. His hands were shaking. "Jake Morrison?" The voice was closer now. He looked up to find the CEO's standing directly in front of him. This close, there was no doubt. 15 years had refined her features, had added lines around her eyes and a confidence to her bearing that hadn't been there in college. But this was Sarah Kovach, who'd shared his dorm room senior year and his dreams of starting a tech company and his bed until the morning she'd packed her bags and disappeared from his life. Sarah, who'd been dead for 15 years. Sarah, who was very much alive and studying his face with the same desperate intensity he felt. "You look familiar," he said, the words coming out strangled and inadequate. She reached up slowly, as if in a dream, and removed her glasses. Without them, her eyes were the same warm brown he remembered, the same eyes that had looked up at him when she'd whispered that she loved him, the same eyes that had been cold and distant the last time he'd seen her. Jake. His name in her voice was a key turning in a lock he'd thought was permanently sealed. 15 years of careful emotional management, of building a life around the fact of her absence, crumbled in the space of that single word. "I." She looked around at the employees still milling in the lobby, at Jake's concerned face, at Emma watching this exchange with growing confusion. "Could we talk? Privately?" Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. He turned to Emma, trying to arrange his features into something approaching normal. "Em, why don't you get started on homework in the break room? I'll be right back." Emma's eyes moved between her father and the CEO, that 14-year-old radar for adult drama clearly pinging. "Okay," she said slowly, "but Dad, you really don't look good." "I'm fine," he lied. Sarah, he couldn't think of her as Sarah Mitchell, couldn't reconcile the professional woman in the expensive suit with the girl who'd worn his old t-shirts and stolen his hoodies, gestured toward a small conference room off the main lobby. They walked in silence, the familiar rhythm of her footsteps next to his creating an emotional vertigo that made the short distance feel endless. She closed the door behind them and leaned against it, as if she needed the support. They stood on opposite sides of the small room, the polished conference table between them, like a buffer zone. "You're supposed to be dead?" Jake said finally. "I know. I have your death certificate. I know. Emma thinks her mother died in a car accident when she was 2. Something flickered across Sarah's face at the mention of Emma. Pain, recognition, something deeper. "How is she?" The question hit him like a physical blow. How dare she ask about Emma as if she had any right to know? How dare she stand there alive and successful and ask after the daughter she'd abandoned? "She's perfect," he said, the words coming out sharper than he'd intended. "She's brilliant and funny and kind, And she's had a good life despite the fact that her mother chose to disappear rather than deal with the consequences of her choices. Sarah flinched as if he'd slapped her. Jake, it's not what you think. Really? Because what I think is that you faked your own death to get out of being a parent. What I think is that you've been living some other life while I've been raising our daughter alone, explaining to her why some kids have mommies and she doesn't, holding her when she cried because some classmate said something cruel about only having a dad. His voice was rising, 15 years of suppressed anger and grief, pouring out in words he'd never expected to have the chance to say. Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but he couldn't find it in himself to care. You have no idea what I've been through, she said quietly. No, I don't. Because you chose to leave. You chose to let me think you were dead rather than have a conversation about what we were going to do about the baby. About Emma. I didn't choose any of this. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Jake wasn't ready to unpack. Before he could respond, there was a soft knock on the conference room door. Mr. Morrison? Emma's voice muffled through the glass. Jake said you needed to sign something before the all-hands meeting? Jake looked through the door to see his daughter standing in the hallway, homework forgotten, clearly worried about him. Behind her, Jake hovered with obvious concern. We'll finish this later, Jake said to Sarah, not caring that it sounded like a threat. He opened the door, and Emma immediately moved to his side, her presence both grounding and complicating. He could feel Sarah's eyes on them, taking in the way Emma unconsciously mirrored his posture, the protective way she positioned herself between him and whatever had upset him. Actually, Sarah said, her voice carefully professional again, I think we should postpone the all-hands meeting until tomorrow. I'd like more time to prepare. The lobby was still full of employees, and several heads turned at this announcement. Jake could see the speculation starting, the way information moved through an office ecosystem. By tomorrow, everyone would know that the new CEO had had some kind of intense conversation with Jake Morrison, and the rumor mill would be working overtime. Emma? Sarah said. And Jake felt his daughter stiffen beside him. You look exactly like your father. It was an innocuous comment, the kind of thing adults said to children all the time. But Jake heard the subtext, saw the way Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Emma, with the brutal honesty of adolescence, studied Sarah's face. Do I know you? No, Sarah said quickly. Too quickly. No, we've never met. But Emma was still looking at her with that puzzled expression that meant she was trying to place something just out of reach. Jake knew that look. It was the same one Emma got when she was working through a particularly difficult math problem, when the solution was there but hadn't quite crystallized yet. I should go, Sarah said. Jake, we'll continue our conversation tomorrow. She walked away quickly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Jake watched her go, noting that she still walked with that slight leftward lean, still touched her hair when she was nervous, still carried herself as if she was apologizing for taking up space. Dad? Emma's voice was small. Who was that, really? Jake looked down at his daughter, at the face that was indeed exactly like his own except for the eyes. Emma had Sarah's eyes, the same warm brown, the same long lashes, the same way of looking at the world as if it held secrets she was determined to uncover. How could he explain that the woman who'd just walked away was her mother? How could he tell Emma that everything she'd believed about her origins was a lie? How could he even begin to process the fact that Sarah was alive, successful, and apparently had been living a completely different life while he'd been mourning her? Just someone I used to know, he said finally. A long time ago. Emma nodded, but Jake could see she wasn't satisfied with the answer. She was 14, old enough to sense undercurrents, old enough to know when adults were being evasive. Come on, he said, putting his arm around her shoulders. Let's go home. I'll order pizza. As they walked toward the parking garage, Jake felt the weight of the conversation ahead of them. Because he would have to tell Emma the truth, eventually. He would have to explain that her mother wasn't dead, that she'd chosen to leave, that she was now back in their lives in the most complicated way possible, But first, he had to figure out how to tell Emma that her entire understanding of her family, of herself, of the story she'd been told about where she came from, was about to change forever. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as they reached the parking garage, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into an uncertain future. The pizza sat untouched on the Kit Morrison counter, grease congealing in orange pools, while Jake stared at his laptop screen without seeing it. Emma had retreated to her room after dinner, claiming she had a history report to finish, but he'd heard her pacing for the last hour. The floorboards in her room creaked in a pattern he recognized: 3 steps to the window, pause, 3 steps back to the desk. It was what she did when she was working through something complicated. He closed the laptop and rubbed his eyes. The house felt different somehow, as if Sarah's presence at the office had shifted the fundamental physics of their life. For 15 years, this modest 2-story in the suburbs had been their sanctuary, filled with Emma's artwork on the refrigerator and soccer cleats by the front door, and the comfortable chaos of a life built for 2. Now it felt fragile, like a house of cards waiting for the next wind. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Really talk. Tomorrow after work?" Jake stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "How did you get this number?" "Same way you got the job at Meridian. I've been keeping track." The words hit him like ice water. Keeping track. For how long? How much of his carefully constructed life had been observed from a distance? How many of Emma's milestones had Sarah witnessed through whatever surveillance network she'd apparently maintained? "Why now?" he typed. The response came quickly. "Because I'm dying." Jake's hands went numb. He set the phone down carefully on the Kit Morrison counter and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood he'd chosen specifically because it was safe, predictable, far from any surprises that might upend their quiet life. The phone buzzed again. 6 months, maybe less. "I needed to see her before." He picked up the phone, deleted the message thread without reading the rest, then immediately regretted it. But the damage was done. The words were burned into his memory. "I'm dying." "Dad?" Emma stood in the Kit Morrison doorway, wearing the oversized flannel shirt she'd stolen from his closet months ago. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, making her look younger than 14, closer to the little girl who used to crawl into his bed during thunderstorms. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. She shook her head and moved to the refrigerator, pulling out a carton of milk. "That woman today, at your work." Jake's chest tightened. "What about her?" "I know this sounds weird, but..." Emma poured milk into a glass, her movements careful and deliberate. "She reminded me of someone. Like, I kept feeling like I should know her face. Maybe she just has one of those faces." Emma turned to look at him directly, and Jake was struck again by how much she'd grown up. When had she developed that particular way of tilting her head when she was thinking? When had her eyes become so penetrating? "Dad, I'm not stupid." The words were quiet but firm. Jake felt something shift between them, a recognition that the dynamic of their relationship was changing. Emma wasn't a child anymore, wasn't content to accept simple explanations for complex adult emotions. "I know you're not stupid." "Em, then don't lie to me." She set the milk glass down with a sharp clink. "Something happened today. Something big. You looked like you'd seen a ghost. And then you got that voice you use when you're trying to protect me from something I'm supposedly too young to understand." Jake studied his daughter's face, seeing Sarah's stubborn chin, Sarah's way of standing when she was preparing for a fight. The resemblance was so strong it made his chest ache. "It's complicated," he said finally. "I'm 14, not 4. I can handle complicated." The words hung between them, a challenge and a plea wrapped together. Jake thought about the conversation he'd been dreading, about the careful way he'd planned to ease Emma into the truth about her mother. He'd imagined they'd have more time, that he could control the timing and the context. Instead, here they were at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night, standing in their Kit Morrison, while the pizza grew cold, and Emma's direct gaze demanded honesty. He wasn't sure he was ready to give. "Your mother," he began, then stopped. The words felt foreign, wrong. For 15 years, Sarah had been a memory, a story he told Emma about a woman who'd loved her but died too soon. Now, she was a living person with a phone number and a terminal diagnosis, and the ability to turn their world upside down. What about her? Emma's voice was carefully controlled, but Jake could hear the undercurrent of hope. Despite all his efforts to make their family of two feel complete, Emma had always carried questions about the woman who'd given birth to her. She didn't die in a car accident. The words came out flat, clinical. Emma blinked, processing. What do you mean? I mean, she left, before you were born. And I thought she was dead because… Jake ran his hands through his hair, searching for a way to explain 15 years of lies and half-truths. Because someone wanted me to think that. Emma's face went very still. Someone? Your mother. The silence stretched between them, filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of their neighbor's television. Emma's milk sat forgotten on the counter. She's alive? The question was barely a whisper. Yes, and she's been alive this whole time? While you told me she was dead? Emma's voice cracked. While I used to talk to her picture and wish I could remember her? Jake felt his heart breaking. I thought she was dead too. I swear to you, I thought. The woman at your office today. Emma's voice was getting stronger, sharper. That was her, wasn't it? Jake nodded, unable to speak. Emma stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked out of the Kit Morrison. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard her bedroom door close with careful control, not a slam, which somehow made it worse. Jake stood alone in the Kit Morrison, surrounded by the debris of their interrupted evening. The pizza, the homework scattered on the counter, the milk glass Emma had abandoned. All the ordinary details of their life, suddenly rendered strange by the weight of truth finally spoken. He cleaned up mechanically, wrapping the pizza, washing the glass, wiping down counters that didn't need to be cleaned. Busy work to keep his hands occupied while his mind raced through the implications of what had just happened. Emma knew. Not everything, not yet, but enough to understand that her entire understanding of her family had been built on a lie. A well-intentioned lie, maybe, but a lie nonetheless. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number, this time a call. Jake? Sarah's voice was rougher now, less controlled than it had been in the office. She knows, he said without preamble. A sharp intake of breath. You told her? She figured it out. Emma's not stupid, Sarah. She could see something was wrong, and she pushed until I told her the truth. How much truth? That you're alive, that you left, that I've been lying to her for 15 years about who her mother is. God! Sarah's voice was thick with something that might have been tears. I never wanted this to happen like this. Then how did you want it to happen? Jake's anger was returning, cutting through the shock and grief. Did you think you could just walk back into our lives and everything would be fine? Did you think Emma wouldn't have questions? I thought I'd have more time. Time for what? To explain. To make you understand why I did what I did. Jake walked to the window again, looking out at the street where Emma had learned to ride a bike, where she'd sold lemonade to raise money for animal shelters, where she'd kissed her first boyfriend last month thinking her father hadn't seen. I'm listening, he said. Not over the phone. This conversation needs to happen in person. Sarah, I can't just… Please. The word was raw, desperate. Tomorrow. After work. There's a coffee shop on 5th Street, near the park where Emma used to play when she was little. Jake felt a chill. How do you know about that park? Silence on the other end of the line. Sarah, how do you know about the park? I've been watching, she said finally. Not constantly, not stalking, but I've needed to know she was okay, that you both were okay. The implications of this hit him like a freight train. All those years of carefully building a life, of protecting Emma from the truth about her mother, and Sarah had been there at the edges, observing. How many moments had she witnessed? How many milestones had she seen from a distance? You had no right? He said. I know. No, you don't know. You have no idea what it's been like, raising her alone, answering her questions about why she doesn't have a mother, watching her pretend she doesn't care when other kids talk about their moms. "Jake? And now you're telling me you've been out there the whole time? Watching us like some kind of nature documentary?" "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Another long silence. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear her. "It was like drowning," she said. "Every day for 15 years it was like drowning." Something in her tone stopped his anger cold. This wasn't the voice of someone who'd made casual choices about her life. This was the voice of someone who'd been in pain for a very long time. "Tomorrow," she said. "Please, let me explain." Jake looked toward the stairs, toward Emma's room where no sound emerged. His daughter was probably lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the fact that everything she'd believed about her family was wrong. "1 hour," he said. "And if I don't like what you have to say, if I think for 1 second that you're going to hurt Emma worse than you already have, you disappear again. Permanently this time. Understood?" The line went dead. Jake stood in his Kit Morrison, holding his phone, wondering how a single day could unmake 15 years of careful construction. This morning, he'd been a single father with a stable job and a daughter who trusted him. Tonight, he was a man whose past had come back from the dead, whose daughter had learned that her entire origin story was a fiction. He climbed the stairs slowly, pausing outside Emma's door. No light showed underneath, but he could sense she was awake. He raised his hand to knock, then stopped. What would he say? What words existed to bridge the gap between the truth she'd known this morning and the reality she was facing tonight? Instead, he went to his own room and sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the framed photo on his nightstand. Emma at 5, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a drawing she'd made of their family. 2 stick figures under a yellow sun. "Daddy and me," written in crayon across the top. For 10 years, that drawing had represented the completeness of their world. Now it felt like evidence of everything he'd failed to give her. Jake lay back on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, knowing sleep wouldn't come. Tomorrow, he would sit across from the woman who'd shaped his entire adult life through her absence. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to trust her with the truth, whether to risk everything he'd built for Emma on the possibility that Sarah's explanations might be worth the devastation they'd already caused. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm, dogs barking in the distance, the hum of air conditioners, the occasional car passing by. All the sounds of ordinary life continuing around them while their world quietly fell apart. The coffee shop on 5th Street had the worn comfort of a place that had survived multiple economic downturns through sheer stubbornness. Jake arrived early, choosing a table near the back where they could talk without being overheard. The late afternoon sun slanted through dusty windows, casting long shadows across mismatched furniture and local artwork that hadn't sold in years. He'd spent the day in a fog of distraction, catching mistakes in code reviews, losing track of conversations mid-sentence. Jake had finally pulled him aside after lunch, concern written across his face. "Whatever's going on with you and the new CEO," Jake had said, "just be careful, okay? Office politics can get ugly fast." If only it were that simple. Emma had left for school that morning without speaking to him, her silence more devastating than any argument. She'd made her own breakfast, packed her own lunch, moved through their morning routine like a ghost haunting their Kit Morrison. The only sign she was still his daughter was the way she'd paused at the front door, her hand on the handle, as if she wanted to say something. But then she'd just shouldered her backpack and walked out into the morning without looking back. Now Jake sat stirring a coffee he didn't want, watching the door and wondering what version of Sarah would walk through it. The polished CEO from yesterday? The girl he'd fallen in love with in college? Or someone else entirely, someone shaped by 15 years of secrets he couldn't begin to imagine. She arrived exactly on time, scanning the coffee shop until she spotted him. She'd traded the power suit for jeans and a simple blue sweater, and without the armor of professional clothing she looked smaller, more vulnerable. The years showed more clearly 2 fine lines around her eyes, a thinness to her face that spoke of recent weight loss. She ordered tea at the counter, her movements careful and deliberate, then walked to his table and sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. This close, in natural light, there was no denying who she was. This was Sarah, aged by time and marked by experiences he'd never shared, but unmistakably the woman who'd once been the center of his world. "You look good," she said finally. "You look like you're dying." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but he didn't apologize. Sarah flinched as if he'd struck her, then nodded. "Because I am." She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder, setting it on the table between them. "Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors are calling it aggressive, which is apparently medical speak for, you're fucked." Jake stared at the folder, not wanting to open it. Not wanting the medical documentation that would make this real. "How long have you known?" 4 months. "Maybe 5. She wrapped her hands around her tea mug, and he noticed how thin her fingers had gotten, how prominent the veins were. "I went to the doctor because I was tired all the time, losing weight. Thought it was stress from the promotion, from taking over Meridian." "You took the CEO job knowing you were dying?" "I took the CEO job because I was dying." Sarah met his eyes directly. "I needed to be close to Emma. To you. I needed." She stopped, swallowed hard. "I needed to try to fix what I broke." "You can't fix this, Sarah. You can't waltz back into our lives with a terminal diagnosis and expect that to make everything okay." "I know that." "Do you? Because Emma didn't sleep last night. She left for school this morning without speaking to me. 15 years of trust, just gone, because I had to tell her that everything she believed about her family was a lie." Sarah's face crumpled slightly, but she held his gaze. "I never wanted her to find out like this." "Then how? What was your plan? Show up at her graduation? Her wedding? Wait until she had kids of her own and then send them a card from Grandma?" "I wasn't supposed to live this long." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Jake wasn't sure he wanted to unpack. Sarah opened the folder and pulled out a document he recognized: Emma's birth certificate. But this wasn't the version he had at home. This one was older, more yellowed, and in the space marked mother's name, it said Sarah Elena Kovac. Not unknown, like the amended version he'd been given 15 years ago. "I didn't fake my death to escape being a parent," Sarah said quietly. "I faked my death to escape being murdered." Jake felt the world tilt slightly. "What?" "The night I left, the night we fought about the baby, about what we were going to do." Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "I went to stay with my cousin Mira." "You remember Mira?" He did. Sarah's older cousin, the one who'd worked for some kind of consulting firm, who'd traveled constantly and spoke 3 languages and had always made Jake feel slightly provincial by comparison. "She wasn't a consultant," Sarah continued. "She was CIA, deep cover, working on something involving weapons trafficking through the Balkans. My family, Jake, my family wasn't just immigrants running a small business. My father was involved in some very dark things during the war, things that followed him to America." Jake stared at her, trying to process what she was telling him. Sarah's family had always been vague about their past, about why they'd left Bosnia when Sarah was small. He'd attributed it to trauma, to the kind of silence that surrounded stories too painful to tell. "Someone found out about Mira's real job," Sarah said. "Someone from the old country, someone with a very long memory and a lot of money. They came after her, but they couldn't find her. So they decided to come after her family instead." "Sarah, 2 days after I moved in with Mira, someone shot out the windows of her apartment. The next day, they found my parents' address, called and left a message saying they knew I was pregnant, that they'd kill the baby unless Mira surrendered herself." The coffee shop around them seemed to fade into background noise. Jake could hear the espresso machine hissing, could see other customers reading newspapers and typing on laptops, could smell the familiar aroma of roasted beans and baked goods. Normal life continuing around them, while Sarah described a world of violence and threats that seemed impossible to reconcile with the quiet suburban existence they'd been living. "Mira had 2 choices," Sarah continued. "Turn herself in and probably die, or disappear and take me with her. But I was 7 months pregnant, Jake. I couldn't just disappear. I couldn't drag a baby into witness protection, couldn't raise Emma in hiding, always looking over our shoulders. So you faked your death. Mira had contacts, people who could create new identities, new histories, but it had to be complete. Everyone had to believe I was really gone, including you. Especially you, because if you thought I was alive, you'd look for me. And if you looked for me, they might find me through you. Jake felt something cold spreading through his chest. The car accident. Staged. Mira's people found a Jane Doe in the morgue, someone who'd been in the water too long to be easily identified. They switched the dental records, created a paper trail. As far as the world knew, Sarah Kovach died in a car accident on Highway 101. And you became Sarah Mitchell. Eventually. First I was Sarah Collins, living in a safe house in Montana while Emma. Sarah's voice broke slightly. While Emma was born, and I couldn't even send you a picture. Then I was Sarah Davis in Oregon, working as a waitress, and sending money anonymously to help with Emma's expenses. Then Sarah Foster in Nevada, Sarah Kim in Arizona, Sarah Mitchell in Colorado. Jake tried to imagine it Sarah alone, pregnant, hiding in a series of anonymous apartments while he'd been preparing a nursery and reading parenting books and trying to figure out how to be a single father. The loneliness of it, the isolation, the constant fear, the money, he said, remembering the mysterious checks that had arrived irregularly over the years, always from different sources, always untraceable. That was you. Sarah nodded. I couldn't send much, couldn't risk creating a pattern that could be traced back to me, but I needed to know you could take care of her. How did you know? About Emma, about us, about. I hired people, private investigators mostly, very discreet, very careful. Just enough information to know you were both safe, both okay. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him the screen. It was a photo of Emma at her 8th grade graduation, smiling in her cap and gown, Jake's arm around her shoulders. Jake stared at the image, remembering that day. He'd been so proud, had taken dozens of photos himself, but he'd never noticed anyone else taking pictures, had never sensed they were being watched. I have hundreds of these, Sarah said quietly. Emma's first steps, her first day of school, soccer games, science fairs, birthday parties. I've been living your life through stolen moments and surveillance photos. The weight of it was staggering. For 15 years, Sarah had been building a shadow version of their family, collecting evidence of Emma's childhood from a distance. All those milestones Jake had navigated alone, all those moments he'd wished he could share with someone who understood how miraculous their daughter was. Sarah had been there, watching, wanting, unable to be part of it. The people who threatened you, Jake said, are they still? Dead, most of them anyway. Mira's assignment ended 5 years ago. The weapons trafficking ring was dismantled, the key players either in prison or in the ground. I could have come back then, could have tried to reclaim my life. But you didn't. Sarah looked down at her hands, wrapped around the tea mug that had long since gone cold. By then, Emma had a life, a good life. She had you, and you were doing such a beautiful job raising her. She was happy and secure and confident, and I was. Sarah's voice got smaller. I was a stranger. I was someone who'd abandoned her family, even if I'd had good reasons. What right did I have to disrupt her happiness? So you stayed dead. I stayed dead. I built a career, worked my way up, told myself I was doing penance by staying away. And then I got the diagnosis, and suddenly staying away wasn't an option anymore. Jake sat back in his chair, trying to process everything Sarah had told him. The story was so far outside the realm of his experience that part of him wondered if this was all an elaborate fiction, a way to make her abandonment seem noble rather than selfish. But the details were too specific, too consistent with the strange little mysteries that had punctuated their life, the untraceable money, the feeling sometimes that they were being watched, the way Emma had always seemed to know things about her mother that Jake had never told her. You could have called, he said finally. 5 years ago, when it was safe, you could have picked up the phone. And said what? Hi, Jake. It's your dead ex-girlfriend. I've been alive this whole time, watching your daughter grow up from a distance. Want to grab coffee?" Despite everything, Jake almost smiled. That was so typical of Sarah, reducing complex emotional situations to their most absurd elements. It was something he'd forgotten about her, that dry humor that could cut through tension like a blade. "Emma would have understood," he said. "She's always been mature for her age, always been able to handle difficult truths. Would she? Or would she have spent the last 5 years wondering why her mother chose to stay away when she could have come home? Would she have been angry that I'd been watching her without her knowledge? Would she have felt like her whole childhood was a performance I'd been critiquing from the audience?" The questions hit closer to home than Jake wanted to admit. Emma was mature, but she was also sensitive, prone to overthinking and self-doubt. Learning that her mother had been alive and choosing to stay away might have been more damaging than believing she was dead. "And now?" Jake asked. "Now that you're dying, what's different?" Sarah looked at him directly, and for a moment he saw past the careful control, past the professional demeanor she'd maintained, even in this conversation. He saw the girl he'd fallen in love with, vulnerable and hopeful, and desperately afraid. "Now, I have 6 months to try to know my daughter before I lose the chance forever," she said. "Now I have 6 months to make sure she understands that leaving her was the hardest thing I've ever done, and that loving her from a distance has been the only thing that's kept me alive all these years." "And what about me?" The question came out more raw than he'd intended. "What about what you put me through? What about 15 years of grief and single parenthood and explaining to Emma why some families are different?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back throughout their conversation. "I know I hurt you. I know I took away your choice, made decisions about Emma's life without consulting you. I know that's unforgivable." "It is unforgivable. I know. But Jake," she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was cold, almost translucent. "I'm asking you to forgive me anyway, not for my sake, but for Emma's. She's going to need both of us to get through what's coming." Jake looked down at their hands, hers so much smaller and frailer than he remembered. 15 years ago, these same hands had touched his face in the dark, had worn the ring he'd saved up 3 months to buy, had packed suitcases and walked out of his life without looking back. Now, they were asking for something he wasn't sure he could give. The coffee shop had grown quieter around them, the afternoon crowd giving way to the early evening regulars. Soon he'd have to go home, face Emma, try to explain a conversation that had upended everything he thought he knew about their history. "I need time," he said finally. "Time is the one thing I don't have much of." "Then we'll have to work with what you've got." Sarah nodded, pulling her hand back. "Thank you." "I'm not promising anything, Sarah. I'm not promising Emma will want to see you, or that she'll forgive you, or that any of this will work out the way you're hoping. I know. But she deserves to know the truth. All of it. And she deserves the chance to decide for herself whether she wants you in her life. That's all I'm asking for." Jake stood up, suddenly exhausted by the weight of everything they'd discussed. "I'll talk to her tonight. Tell her. Tell her what you told me. And then we'll see." Sarah remained seated, looking small and lost in the oversized sweater. "Jake?" He turned back. "Thank you for taking such good care of her. She's extraordinary, and that's because of you." Jake felt his throat tighten. "She's extraordinary because she's your daughter too." He left Sarah sitting alone in the coffee shop, surrounded by the debris of their conversation and the ghosts of 15 years of separation. As he walked to his car, Jake tried to prepare himself for the hardest conversation of his life, telling his daughter that her mother was alive, dying, and wanted to know her before it was too late. The sun was setting as he pulled into his driveway, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of the watercolors Emma used to paint when she was small. Simple, bold strokes that captured something essential about the world, even if they weren't technically perfect. Tonight, he would have to find his own simple, bold strokes to paint a picture of their family that included all the complexity Sarah had brought back into their lives. Tonight, he would have to trust that love could be stronger than secrets, that truth could heal even when it initially wounded. Inside the house, he could hear Emma practicing piano, the melody of a Chopin nocturne drifting through the walls. She played when she was thinking, when she needed to work through complicated emotions. The music was beautiful and melancholy, a perfect soundtrack for the conversation they were about to have. Emma's fingers stumbled over the keys as Jake entered the living room, the Chopin nocturne dissolving into silence. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders tensed in a way that told him she'd been waiting for this conversation, dreading it and needing it in equal measure. "How long have you been home?" he asked. "An hour." Her voice was carefully neutral. "I made dinner. It's in the fridge if you want it." Jake looked toward the Kit Morrison, where he could see covered plates waiting on the counter. Emma had been cooking for herself since she was 12, but she'd never made dinner for both of them without being asked. The gesture felt like an olive branch, or maybe an apology for her silence that morning. We need to talk." "I know." She finally turned around on the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap. "You met with her, didn't you? With my mother." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with 15 years of absence and imagination. Jake had always been careful about how he referred to Sarah around Emma, usually opting for neutral phrases like "the woman who gave birth to you" or "your birth mother." But Emma had said "my mother" with a kind of tentative ownership that made his chest tight. "Yes, her name is Sarah. Sarah Mitchell now, though when I knew her, she was Sarah Kovacs." "Kovacs?" Emma repeated the name slowly, as if testing how it felt in her mouth. "That's Eastern European, right? Bosnian. Her family came here when she was small, refugees from the war." Emma nodded, filing away this piece of information about her heritage. Jake realized how little he'd told her about Sarah's background, how much of Emma's genetic and cultural history had been a blank space in their family narrative. Why didn't she die in a car accident? Emma's question was direct, cutting through any attempt he might have made to ease into the conversation gradually. Jake sat down in the armchair across from the piano, trying to figure out how to explain Sarah's story in a way that wouldn't terrify his 14-year-old daughter. But Emma was watching him with that penetrating gaze, the one that meant she'd know if he was softening the truth. "She was in danger," he said finally. "Someone was threatening to hurt her, to hurt you before you were born. She had to disappear to keep you safe." "What kind of danger?" "Bad people. People from her family's past, from the war in Bosnia. Her cousin was involved in some kind of government work, and these people wanted to hurt the cousin through Sarah." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "So she faked her death to protect me?" "To protect all of us, but yes, primarily you." "And you didn't know? This whole time you really thought she was dead?" "I really thought she was dead. I mourned her, Em. I grieved for the life we'd planned together, for the mother you'd never get to know. I would never have lied to you about something like that." Emma's expression softened slightly. "I know, Dad. I was angry last night, but I know you wouldn't lie to me on purpose." The forgiveness in her voice was almost more than Jake could handle. Emma had every right to be furious with him, with Sarah, with the entire situation. Instead, she was sitting there trying to understand, trying to piece together a story that must have seemed impossible. "Where has she been all this time?" Emma asked. "Different places. She's had to change her identity several times, move around, make sure those people couldn't find her. She's been sending money sometimes anonymously to help with your expenses." The mystery checks. Emma's eyes widened with recognition. "You always said you didn't know where they came from." "Because I didn't. Not until today." Emma stood up from the piano bench and began pacing, 3 steps to the window, pause, 3 steps back. Her thinking pattern, the same one Jake had heard through the ceiling the night before. "Has she been watching us?" Emma asked suddenly. Jake hesitated. This was the part of Sarah's story that felt most invasive, most difficult to justify. "Sometimes, from a distance. She hired people to take pictures to make sure we were okay." "Pictures of me?" "Yes." Emma stopped pacing. "Show me." I don't have." "She showed you pictures today, didn't she? That's how you know she's been watching." "Show me." Jake pulled out his phone, scrolling through the photos Sarah had shared with him before he'd left the coffee shop. She'd texted him several, including the graduation photo and a few others. Emma at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning at a soccer game. Emma at 10, concentrating intently at a science fair. Emma last month, walking out of school with her friends. He handed Emma the phone, watching her face as she scrolled through images of herself, taken by a stranger who was also her mother. Her expression was unreadable, cycling through confusion, wonder, and something that might have been grief. "This one," Emma said, stopping at a photo Jake hadn't seen before. It showed Emma at about age 5, sitting on the swings at the park near their house, but in the background, barely visible, was the figure of a woman watching from a distance. "Is that her?" Jake squinted at the image. The woman was too far away to make out clearly, but something about her posture, the way she held herself, looked familiar. "Maybe," he said. Emma stared at the photo for a long time. "I remember this day," she said quietly. "I remember feeling like someone was watching me, but when I looked around, I didn't see anyone. You were pushing me on the swings, and I kept looking over at the trees because I felt like there was someone there who cared about me." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. How many times had Emma felt that presence, that sense of being observed by someone who loved her? How many moments had she intuited her mother's attention without understanding what it was? "She wants to meet you," Jake said. "To talk to you, to try to explain everything herself." "Does she want to be my mom now?" Emma's question was small, vulnerable. Like, does she want to move in and make up for lost time and pretend like the last 15 years didn't happen? "No, Em, she's—" Jake struggled with how much to tell her, how much reality a 14-year-old could handle. "She's sick. Very sick. She doesn't have a lot of time left, and she wanted the chance to know you before she dies, for real this time." "Yeah." Emma sat back down on the piano bench, her hands finding the keys automatically. She played a few soft chords, nothing recognizable, just sounds to fill the silence while she thought. "What's she like?" Emma asked finally. "She's—" Jake tried to reconcile the girl he'd known in college with the woman he'd sat across from that afternoon. "She's smart, really smart. She was studying computer science when we met. Wanted to start her own company someday. She's stubborn, sometimes to a fault. She has this way of making decisions and then refusing to second-guess herself, even when everyone else thinks she's wrong. Like me, very like you. She's also kind, even when kindness costs her something. And she's funny, though her humor is sometimes a little dark. She sees things other people miss, notices details." "What did she think of me? From the pictures?" Jake smiled despite the complexity of everything they were discussing. "She said you look exactly like me, but you have her eyes. She's proud of you, Em. So proud of the person you've become." Emma's fingers found a melody on the piano, something sad and beautiful that Jake didn't recognize. "I want to meet her," she said without looking up from the keys. "Are you sure? You don't have to decide right now. You can take time to think about it." "I've been thinking about her my whole life, Dad. Even when I thought she was dead, I wondered what she would have been like. What she would have thought of me, whether she would have been proud of who I was becoming." Emma's playing grew more complex, the melody weaving through itself. "Now I have the chance to know, and I might never get another chance." Jake felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. Emma was being so mature about this, so thoughtful and brave. But she was also 14, and he wasn't sure she fully understood what she was agreeing to: the emotional complexity of meeting a dying parent, the grief that would come when Sarah was gone, the questions that would arise about the family they might have been. "What if it's hard?" he asked. "What if seeing her makes you angry or sad, or confused about everything you thought you knew about our family?" Emma stopped playing and looked at him directly. "Dad, finding out she's alive already changed everything I thought I knew about our family. The question isn't whether this is going to be hard, it's whether I want to go through the hard stuff while she's still here to answer my questions, or after she's gone and I'll never get the chance." The wisdom in her words took Jake's breath away. When had his daughter become so clear-sighted about emotional complexity? When had she developed this ability to cut through fear and uncertainty to the heart of what mattered? "Okay," he said. We'll arrange for you to meet her. When? Soon. This weekend maybe. Somewhere neutral, somewhere you'll feel comfortable. Emma nodded, then turned back to the piano. The melody she'd been playing resolved into something Jake recognized, a lullaby he used to sing to her when she was small, one he'd learned from his own mother. But Emma was playing it in a minor key, transforming the simple comfort of the original into something more complex, more adult. "Dad?" she said, without stopping her playing. "Yeah? Are you okay with all this, I mean? It can't be easy for you either, having her come back." Jake looked at his daughter, this extraordinary person he'd had the privilege of raising, and felt overwhelmed by her capacity for empathy. Even in the middle of her own emotional upheaval, she was thinking about his feelings, his experience. "I'm still figuring that out," he said honestly. "I loved her once, a long time ago, and I spent 15 years being angry at her for leaving, even though I thought she was dead. Now I have to figure out how to forgive her, how to let go of all that anger when I finally understand why she left." "Do you think you can forgive her?" "I think I have to try. For you, but also for me. Carrying that anger around for 15 years has been exhausting." Emma played the lullaby through to its end, the final notes hanging in the air between them. Outside, the sun had finished setting, and the living room was growing dark around them. Jake reached over to turn on a lamp, and in its warm glow, Emma looked both very young and impossibly mature. "Will you be there?" she asked. "When I meet her?" "If you want me to be." "I do. I think I'm going to need both my parents for this." The word parents sent a jolt through Jake. For 15 years, he'd been Emma's only parent, her complete family. The idea of sharing that role, even temporarily, even with Emma's biological mother, felt strange and frightening, and somehow right all at once. "Then I'll be there," he promised. Emma closed the piano lid and stood up. "I'm going to go do homework," she said. "But Dad, thank you for telling me the truth, all of it. I know it couldn't have been easy." She kissed his forehead, a gesture so adult and gracious that Jake felt his eyes burn with unshed tears. As Emma headed upstairs, Jake remained in the darkening living room, thinking about the conversation he needed to have with Sarah, about arrangements that needed to be made, about the careful choreography required to bring a mother and daughter together after 15 years of separation. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. How did she take it? Jake typed back, "She wants to meet you." The response came immediately. "When?" "This weekend. I'll call you tomorrow with details. Thank you, Jake." "Thank you for giving me this chance." Jake set his phone aside and sat in the quiet living room, listening to Emma moving around upstairs, preparing for what might be the most important weekend of her life. In 2 days they would all be in the same room together, Jake, Emma, and Sarah. The family they'd never quite been, finally complete, just in time for it to be broken again by loss. But maybe that was enough. Maybe the chance to know each other, even briefly, was worth the inevitable grief that would follow. Maybe love didn't require permanence to be real. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm, and Jake began planning for a reunion 15 years in the making. The park where they'd agreed to meet was the same one from Emma's childhood photos, where she'd learned to swing and climb and navigate the complex social dynamics of playground politics. Jake arrived early with Emma, both of them gravitating toward the bench where he'd spent countless Saturday mornings watching her play, cheering her small victories and comforting her small defeats. Emma wore the blue dress she'd chosen for 8th grade graduation, the one that brought out her eyes and made her look older than her 14 years. She'd spent an hour getting ready, changing clothes 3 times before settling on something that struck the right balance between presentable and authentically herself. "She's late," Emma said, checking her phone for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. "She's 3 minutes late. That's not late." What if she changed her mind? What if she decided this was too hard and just left again? Jake could hear the vulnerability beneath Emma's carefully maintained composure. She'd been strong through all of this, mature beyond her years, but she was still a teenager meeting her mother for the first time. The fear of rejection, of abandonment, was written in the tension of her shoulders and the way she kept smoothing her dress. "She'll be here," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. "She's wanted this for 15 years. She's not going to change her mind now." A figure appeared at the far end of the park, walking slowly along the path that wound through the trees. Sarah moved carefully, as if each step required conscious effort, and Jake realized how much the disease had progressed even in the few days since their coffee shop conversation. She wore a simple green cardigan over dark jeans, and she'd tied her hair back in a way that made her look younger, more like the girl Jake remembered from college. "Is that her?" Emma asked, and Jake could hear his daughter's voice tighten with emotion. "That's her." Emma stood up from the bench, smoothing her dress one final time. "How do I look?" "Perfect," Jake said, and meant it. "You look perfect." Sarah approached slowly, and Jake could see her taking in every detail of Emma's appearance, her height, her posture, the way she held herself with nervous grace. When she was close enough to speak, Sarah stopped, maintaining a respectful distance that acknowledged the magnitude of this moment. "Emma," she said, and the name sounded like a prayer in her mouth. "Mom." Emma's voice was barely a whisper, testing out the word she'd never been able to use. They stood looking at each other for a long moment. Two people connected by biology and separated by 15 years of history. Jake felt like an intruder on this reunion, but also like a bridge between them, the one person who loved them both and understood what this moment meant to each of them. "You're beautiful," Sarah said finally. "I mean, I knew you would be, from the photos, but seeing you in person," her voice caught. "You're so much more than I imagined." Emma blushed, pleased despite her nervousness. "You look like me. I look like you. People always said I looked like Dad, but now I can see." She gestured vaguely at Sarah's face. "The eyes, especially. Your father's right, though. You have his chin, his way of standing. But you have my hands." Sarah held up her own hands, and Jake could see the resemblance, the long fingers, the narrow palms, the way both Emma and Sarah gestured when they spoke. "Can we sit?" Emma asked, glancing at the bench. "You look tired." Sarah's smile was soft with gratitude. "I am tired." "Thank you." They arranged themselves on the bench, Emma in the middle, Jake and Sarah on either side, like bookends around their daughter. The positioning felt both natural and surreal, this family tableau they'd never been able to create when it might have mattered most. "I have questions," Emma said without preamble. "A lot of questions." "I have answers," Sarah replied. "Maybe not good ones, but honest ones. Why didn't you come back sooner?" "Dad said the danger was over 5 years ago." Sarah looked down at her hands, and Jake could see her wrestling with how much truth to share. "Because I was afraid," she said finally. "Afraid you'd hate me for leaving. Afraid you were better off without me. Afraid I'd disrupt the beautiful life your father had built for you. But you were watching us. You knew about my life, my friends, my school. I knew the outside of your life. I knew you were smart and talented and happy, but I didn't know what you thought about before you fell asleep, or what made you laugh, or what you worried about. I didn't know you." Sarah's voice was thick with regret. "I convinced myself that loving you from a distance was enough, that being a good mother meant staying away." Emma considered this, her mature mind working through the complexity of Sarah's choices. "Were you lonely?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it cut through all of Sarah's careful explanations to the heart of her experience. Jake saw Sarah's composure crack, saw 15 years of isolation and sacrifice flash across her face. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "Every day, every single day." Emma reached over and took Sarah's hand, the gesture so natural and generous that Jake felt his heart break a little. His daughter, this extraordinary person he'd raised, was comforting the woman who'd abandoned her, offering grace where she had every right to offer anger. "I used to pretend you were watching me," Emma said. "When I was little, before I really understood what death meant, I used to think maybe you were invisible. Maybe you were there at my soccer games and school plays and birthday parties. Dad thought I was just being imaginative, but I really felt like someone was there. "I was there," Sarah said softly. "Not always, but for the important things. Your first soccer goal when you were 6, your science fair presentation about volcanoes, your piano recital last spring when you played that Debussy piece." Emma's eyes widened. "You were at my recital?" "In the back row. You were incredible, Em, so poised, so musical. I cried through the entire performance." Jake felt a complex mixture of emotions, anger that Sarah had been there without his knowledge, admiration for her dedication to witnessing Emma's milestones, sadness for all the moments they could have shared openly if circumstances had been different. "What's it like?" Emma asked. "Being sick, I mean. Are you scared?" Jake tensed, wondering if this question was too difficult, too adult for a 14-year-old to be asking her dying mother. But Sarah met Emma's gaze directly, treating her daughter with the respect of someone capable of handling hard truths. "Sometimes," Sarah said. "Not of dying exactly, but of running out of time. There's so much I want to know about you, so much I want to share. I'm scared that 6 months won't be enough to really know you, to help you understand how much I've loved you all these years." "Then we'd better not waste any time," Emma said with a practicality that was pure Jake, combined with a directness that was purely Sarah. They talked for 2 hours in the park, about small things and large ones. Sarah told Emma stories about her own childhood in Bosnia, about the grandmother Emma was named after, about family traditions and recipes and songs that had been lost when Sarah disappeared. Emma talked about school and friends and her plans for high school, about the novel she was writing and her dreams of maybe studying music or maybe computer science like her mother had. Jake mostly listened, watching the tentative connection forming between them. There was an ease to their conversation that surprised him, as if the 15 years of separation had somehow prepared them for this moment rather than making it more difficult. Emma asked direct questions, and Sarah gave honest answers. Sarah shared stories and Emma listened with the kind of attention she usually reserved for things that fascinated her. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to look more tired, the effort of this emotional reunion taking a visible toll on her already weakened system. Emma noticed before Jake did, her natural empathy picking up on her mother's fatigue. "We should probably go," Emma said gently. "You need to rest." Sarah nodded, though Jake could see how much she didn't want this time to end. "Can we do this again? Soon? Tomorrow?" Emma suggested. "Maybe we could go somewhere else. I could show you my school, or we could get lunch somewhere." "I'd like that very much." They stood up from the bench, the 3 of them together in the late afternoon light. For a moment, Jake could almost imagine what their family might have looked like if circumstances had been different. Weekend trips to this park, family dinners, bedtime stories shared between 2 parents instead of carried by one. Sarah turned to Jake, her expression grateful and apologetic in equal measure. "Thank you," she said, "for raising her so well, for giving me this chance, for—" She gestured helplessly, unable to articulate the magnitude of what he'd given her. "She's incredible," Jake said simply. "But you already knew that." Emma hugged Sarah goodbye, the embrace tentative at first but growing warmer as Sarah's arms closed around her daughter. Jake watched this reunion he'd never thought possible, this moment of grace in the middle of tragedy, and felt something in his chest that had been tight for 15 years finally begin to loosen. As they walked back to their cars, Emma slipped her hand into Jake's. "That wasn't as hard as I thought it would be," she said. "How do you feel?" "Sad," Emma said honestly, "but also grateful. Like, I know we can't have everything we missed, but at least we can have something. At least I can know her a little bit before she's really gone." That night, Jake lay in bed thinking about the afternoon, about the strange gift of watching Emma meet her mother, about the complicated grace of second chances that come too late to change the past, but not too late to matter. Tomorrow they would meet again, and the day after that, and for however many days Sarah had left. It wouldn't be enough time. It would never be enough time to make up for 15 years of separation, 15 years of missed birthdays and scraped knees and bedtime stories. But maybe it would be enough time for Emma to understand that she had been loved, completely and desperately, by a mother who had made impossible choices in an impossible situation. Maybe it would be enough time for Sarah to know that her daughter had grown up strong and kind and brilliant, that her sacrifice had protected something precious. Maybe it would be enough time for Jake to forgive, to let go of the anger he'd carried for so long, to find peace with a story that had no villains, only people doing their best in circumstances beyond their control. Outside his window, the neighborhood was quiet, settled into its familiar rhythms. But inside Jake's heart, something was shifting, making room for a different kind of family than the one he'd built over the past 15 years. Not a replacement for what they'd had, but an expansion of it. A family that included everyone who had loved Emma, everyone who had shaped her, everyone who would grieve when Sarah was gone. In the darkness, Jake began to plan for the days ahead, for the careful choreography of building a relationship under the shadow of approaching loss. They would have lunch tomorrow, and dinner next week, and maybe Sarah would come to Emma's soccer game on Saturday. They would create new memories to sustain them through the grief that was coming, moments of connection that would prove love could be real even when it couldn't be permanent. It was a different kind of happy ending than any of them had imagined, but it was theirs, and it was enough.